Alright, let's take a look at today's agenda. So in today's session, we are going to deploy an application to our Minikube cluster. And the application is nothing but a dummy application. So first of all, what we're going to do to deploy our application, we are going to create a Kubernetes cluster. After watching this video, you are going to be 100% confident how to deploy an application on Minikube and what are those service types, particularly ClusterIP, node port, and load balancer. What are the differences between them? So without a further ado, let's get started. I'm gonna name my cluster, let's say dab. If you do not say anything, then cluster name is going to be Minikube, okay? So this is fine at this point. CPUs is going to be 2 CPUs, this is the minimum requirement, and the memory is going to be, let's say, 1800 MB. And the other thing I want to do, I want to say, hey, Kubernetes version I want to run basically is this v1.28.1. This is the version I want to run. What this command is going to do is basically create a Kubernetes cluster, and I'm actually using Docker, right? For each node, I'm actually allocating 2 CPUs and 1800 for the memory, okay, 1800 MB. So let's get started. Once I enter, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Creating Docker container. If you are really worried about whether you should run it or not as root, you can actually run Docker as rootless, or you can run podman actually on your local computer. But for me, I'm not too much worried at this point. Okay, our cluster is created. So Minikube status, if you run this command, is going to say this is the cluster name, okay? And this is the control plane, meaning that this is the master node. This is the master node. And this is my worker node, okay? So I have 2 node Kubernetes cluster. One is serving as worker node, the other one is serving as the master node. So we're gonna run kubectl get nodes, and here you can see the version of our Kubernetes cluster, right? And if you wanna see a little bit more, you can just expand it like so. So this is what going to tell you a little bit more. So this particular node is running on Ubuntu. This is the version. This is the kernel version, as you can see. And here is the Docker version, right? Excellent. And right now, if you see kubectl, there is nothing running. So I talked about the namespaces before. I'm gonna show you still, if you're new to my channel, there are like 4 namespaces created by default. Okay, so here is the IP address for this particular node, and this is the IP address you can see for this master node. If you run this command kubectl, let's get sbc, which is service, when you create a Kubernetes cluster, it creates a service called Kubernetes, and it has the cluster IP type. This is a virtual IP. This is being taken care by kubeproxy actually, and it has no external IP, right? So what we're gonna do, we are going to be marking this one. We created a Kubernetes cluster, right? We are actually going to, this one is done. I will just uncheck this. I actually mistakenly checked them. So the first one is checked. We created a cluster, and the cluster actually has, so if we run this Minikube IP, it's gonna give you the IP, right? So the master node IP basically. So let's jump into this one, deploy a simple application. So let's go ahead and see. Now you see it's actually pretty quick. So our deployment is in there. You try to see the pod, get pods. You can see the pod is running. So one thing you want to see is basically where this particular pod is actually scheduled. So if you look at here, this is the worker node, right? And this pod has an IP address. This is a VIP, basically a virtual IP that kubeproxy. The second thing, what we want to do, we want to see replica set. So you can see 2 replica set is basically, we are saying that, okay, current is actually 2 pods are running, right? And 2 is actually desired because we said, hey, replica, you give me 2 replicas, run 2 replicas at all time, right? So this is what exactly is doing. Next one we want to see is this one. EP command is basically the endpoint command. So at this point, you don't see actually nothing other than Kubernetes because we have not created any service for it. So let's jump into this part. So we created, basically, we deployed the application to our Kubernetes cluster, but this service is not actually exposed to anywhere. So what we're gonna do this time, we're gonna expose our service. To expose this, we're gonna run this command, expose and deployment. Remember, if you are not putting the name demo, it's not gonna work. It's because I talked about the label, right? And this label, I'm gonna show it to you first. Maybe this is something very important. Talking about pod. Pod is which one? Demo, right? Oops. Oh yeah, doesn't matter because it was starting with the demo. So if you look at here, it has a label demo. Service discovery has a selector which will be actually exactly the same name. So the service actually can discover which pod it has to send the traffic, right? One thing here is important is basically talk about it after some seconds because I will talk about it after some seconds, not now. Okay, let's talk about this. So you're gonna expose the service. So you're gonna say kubectl expose deployment demo. You have to have the same name. What you have in the label is because we are using the CLI, right? So we need to make sure that the service can be exposed on a particular port. So this is the one we are going to be using. So you can say type like ClusterIP. This is the default one. If you don't set, it's absolutely fine. So if you put it, it's okay. If you don't put it, that's also fine. The port is going to be what? 8080. This is the port we are going to expose. So basically our service, which will be called demo, is going to be exposed to this port. Okay, so let's say kubectl get SBC. So this time you can see a service is actually created. Doesn't have an external IP. It has a cluster IP. We'll talk about it. And then the service is exposed on this particular port. Okay. Now what happens if you want to actually access this service from your browser? So let's say you went to your browser. So if you go here on your browser, you cannot. It's because when you say cluster IP, your cluster is not accessible from outside the cluster. Meaning that now I'm in my browser, right? And Kubernetes is running on Docker containers, right? The entire Minikube cluster is running on Docker container. So this Docker container or the Kubernetes cluster is not exposed outside of this cluster. So right now I'm on my local host trying to access Kubernetes and it doesn't know how to reach it, right? So this is what you need to keep in mind. What we're gonna run a command called minikube service and then list. Here you can see we have a service called demo. These two you don't have to care at this point, just focus on this one. Okay, there is a way actually to access the service if we do a port forwarding. So actually we expose the service. This one we mark and we actually did scale replicas to 2 or more, right? We did that. So the next one I'm going to show you is this one, minikube service, and this service we called demo, right? And if I enter now, this is minikube specific, remember this guys. I'm actually able to access the service. And if you look at to the URL, you can see it's not 8080, it is 54097, right? I will make it bigger for you. So this is the response we get back. And this is the one you see is the pod, basically name of the pod, okay? So if you go here and type in, let's say, kubectl get pod wide, it's like sk, right? So you can say msk, right? This request is actually handled by this particular pod. Remember one thing, Minikube, what it did behind the hood, it basically created a tunnel so that the traffic from this computer can be forwarded to your Kubernetes cluster. So meaning that to your service and service to your pods. The to and from communication is actually established by a Kubernetes via Minikube tunnel. So Minikube actually doing the networking part here. Okay. So what happens if I actually, let me show you. What happens if I kill this? Remember here, if I kill this, I would not be able to access this service, right? Right away, you can see you can't access it. So what I'm trying to say is that if you have a cluster IP type, you cannot access your cluster from outside the cluster, okay? Another way I would be talking about, so it's basically kubectl port forward, and you want to port forward to 127.0.0.1 to this IP. So basically I'm talking about my Mac, right? And to this port, let's say. So you want to actually forward the traffic. So it's basically, this is the endpoint, right? So if I'm going to this one and trying to reload, it's actually able to access my Kubernetes cluster. It's because this time we are doing a port forward. What is port forward? It's nothing but forwarding this traffic from my local computer to all the way to Kubernetes cluster. When we run this command, if you remember, when we executed this command, right here, it was here, executed this command, Minikube randomly picked up a port number, right? When we run the command of port forward, we specified, okay, this is the port this service should be listening to, right? So this is what exactly is happening. So this is also port forward, and behind the hood, Minikube actually did the port forwarding right here. So it's basically forwarding the traffic from, to and from your Kubernetes cluster. So this is one way of accessing your service. Alright, so if I kill this, it means that I am not actually able to access my service. Now, I'm going to show you what happened. If I go to node list, I can see the IP address of this particular node. IP address of, this is the internal IP of this node, remember, okay? Alright, we talked about port forward, and I'm going to actually show you demo for the cluster IP. So I'm going to deep dive a bit more for you guys. So if I'm running this command kubectl get EP, now this time it's actually giving you endpoints. So basically your service, this is basically the IP address of your pod. So if I'm running this command, because we have two ports, right? If you look at here, oh yeah, we need to actually run this command. You can see IP address of one pod is 10.blah.blah.03 and the other one has 1.3. So this is the worker node, right? Worker node. And 8080, remember, we exposed our service. So basically the pod is actually serving or listening on this particular port, right, to serve our service. So pod is basically running the service on this particular port, right? Excellent. What we're gonna do now, if I do a curl from my computer, you know it's not gonna work. So 127.0.0.1 and then 88, it's not gonna work because it's not listening on my local host. It's listening on the pod which has a particular IP, and this is where we can access it. So now I'm going to actually SSH Minikube node list, and this time I'm gonna do Minikube SSH. So if you do not say node, like this is N means node in short. If I don't say like Minikube M02 whatever how to pronounce, if I do not pass anything, then it is going to actually SSH to my master node. So let's see. So this is how you SSH. So if I'm saying this, then I get the IP address, right? So if you have noticed Minikube hostname, this I get the IP address, right? The IP address of which one? This is the IP address of the node, not the pod. We are not talking about. This time, if I'm running this command called kubectl get EP, this is where our service is exposed. And if I'm doing a curl right now, so I'm inside the node, and you can see I get a response back, right? So if I'm doing curl minus I and then curl minus capital I, and then I basically take this, I'm gonna get also a status code, you can see, right? We can access this. So here is still within the cluster. So what happens if I go to the second, and if you try this, let me do the same. If I try this, actually I can, right? Now we talked about this kubectl get service, and we have this service called demo. So kubectl describe service, and we want to describe this demo. And notice here is the endpoints. Service actually knows which pod to talk, right? Is because service has a selector called app demo, because the selector is basically to filter out the objects. So in Kubernetes context, pod is an object, for example. So when request comes in from my browser, from anywhere, it basically knows how to forward this traffic to its backend pod, basically, right? So this is how actually service does a discovery. Okay. So the second thing we want to look into, I need to go back here. So kubectl get, as we see, ClusterIP. So this time you can see ClusterIP in listening on this particular port. So if I'm doing this with 8080, I should be able to access it. So you can see ClusterIP has exposed this service, right, on this particular port. So what we have learned. So this is a node. From this node, I could basically access my service. My service is running basically on those two ports, right? And remember, the other pod is basically running on the other node. So if you ping from this node to another node, they will be able to talk, right? So the communication is basically taken care by Kube, the ClusterIP type that we talked about, the service type. It does the communication. So now if I'm going back and I say Minikube node list, this time I'm gonna do Minikube SSH, and this time going to be SSHing to this particular node. And here, let me go back again and copy this stuff. If I'm doing this one, and this, I'm able to actually access my service, right? Similarly, if I'm doing the same to to these endpoints, I would be still able to access my service. So what I'm trying to say is that from within the cluster, you can actually access the service. But this time, if I'm in the node, right? Oh, by the way, let me show you curl -I, right? This time, if you are trying to do, like, you might have the question, oh, you were able to, what about the localhost? Because you were inside the cluster. So basically, we are on the second node. So what happens if I try to curl? It's not going to work. It's because we are actually trying to access this service on this particular node, right? On this particular port. But this is why our service actually is not running, because service is running in this node. If you might have guessed the answer already, right? In this node, in the pod. Pod is hosted right here. So remember this. This is why it doesn't work, right? So what happens if you try to access the other pod? Actually, you would be still able to do so. So if I'm doing this, curl this, and then 8080, I should be able to access it. So this is what is ClusterIP. What does it mean? So basically, from within the cluster, you can access your service. You cannot access your service outside of the cluster. So now what we have learned, basically, what ClusterIP does, right? And when should we actually use it? So for example, if you want to expose your service to the public, you need to use the load balancer. We'll be talking about it in the next video. So if you find this video useful, give it a thumbs up, and talk to you soon in another video. Thank you everyone. Bye bye.